By the winter of 1943, the air war over Europe had reached a breaking point. The Allies had promised daylight precision bombing would cripple Germany's war machine, factories, refineries, and rail yards, without the need for invasion. But the skies told a crueler story. Flying Fortress and Liberator crews left English airfields in tight formations, engines droning across the cold North Sea. They believed their armor and guns could protect them. They believed the bomber stream could fight its way to the target and back. They were wrong. Over Germany, the Luftwaffe waited. Bf-109s and Fw-190s rose in swarms, guided by radar and ground observers. The results were brutal. On missions like Schweinfurt-Regensburg, losses exceeded 20%. Entire squadrons vanished over enemy territory. Crews who survived described waves of fighters tearing through the formations, cannon shells ripping aluminum apart, engines on fire, men jumping into freezing air. The Royal Air Force, flying by night, faced its own disasters. Cities bombed in darkness, but little accuracy. The U.S. 8th Air Force refused to follow. Its doctrine demanded daylight raids, surgical strikes against specific industrial targets. But by late 1943, the arithmetic was simple. No escort, no survival. The best Allied fighters, the Spitfire and P-47 Thunderbolt, could only accompany bombers part of the way. Their fuel tanks ran dry long before the bombers even crossed into central Germany. Once the escorts turned home, the Luftwaffe attacked freely. Commanders in England watched mission reports pile up with grim consistency. Heavy bomber losses, limited results, and crew morale collapsing. Some commanders privately questioned whether the daylight bombing campaign could continue at all. The Germans, meanwhile, had every reason for confidence. They controlled the skies over the Reich. Their fighter bases, dispersed across occupied Europe, formed a protective shield. American bombers that reached Germany faced not minutes but hours of interception. At the heart of this imbalance was range, the invisible line that separated hope from disaster. In late 1943, the Allies searched desperately for a solution. Engineers experimented with extra fuel tanks, new propeller designs, even mid-air refueling concepts, all with limited success. The Thunderbolt, powerful but inefficient, burned fuel too fast. The Spitfire, agile but delicate, could not carry the weight. Somewhere in California, however, an aircraft existed that few in Europe had seen. Designed not by a government order but by North American Aviation's private initiative, it was sleek, aerodynamic, and efficient, a machine that seemed to belong to a future war. They called it the Mustang. Originally built for the British as an emergency stopgap, it entered the war quietly. Early versions were unimpressive at altitude, dismissed by many as another short-range fighter. But its design held secrets: laminar flow wings, an efficient radiator system, and internal space that could handle long-distance fuel carriage if properly configured. Then came the transformation. The Merlin engine, the same power plant that roared inside the Spitfire. When fitted to the Mustang's clean airframe, the combination became almost unnatural. Speed, range, and power balanced perfectly. Now, the question wasn't whether the Allies had the right plane. It was whether they could make it fly far enough. In 1943, engineers proposed a daring addition: external fuel tanks that could be jettisoned once empty. These drop tanks would hang beneath the wings, feeding the main engine through simple lines. Light, aerodynamic, and disposable, they could extend range by hundreds of miles. But the idea was risky. Fuel tanks under the wings were vulnerable to gunfire. If they leaked, the aircraft could ignite. If they were too heavy, maneuverability would suffer. Pilots were skeptical. But the need outweighed the fear. Somewhere between theory and desperation, a quiet revolution was taking shape in Allied hangars, one that would soon alter the course of the entire air war. Because if these tanks worked, fighters could go anywhere the bombers went, even to Berlin, and Germany would learn what that meant soon enough. By early 1944, the Allied air strategy hinged on a single idea: reach deep enough into Germany to destroy its war industry at the source. But to do that, they needed a fighter that could escort the bombers from English airfields to Berlin and back, to 200-mile round trip across some of the most dangerous skies on Earth. At the heart of this challenge stood the North American P-51 Mustang, a fighter that had evolved faster than any aircraft of the war. Its sleek profile and laminar flow wing reduced drag to levels previously unseen. It could cruise economically, climb quickly, and dive like a bullet. But range remained the one barrier that held it back. That problem would be solved not in a design lab, but on the flight line. North American's engineers, alongside the U.S. Army Air Force's technical staff, began testing external fuel tanks in late 1943. These weren't standard steel drums bolted to wings. They were built for performance and disposability. Crafted from thin aluminum or even impregnated paper composites, they could carry 75 to 108 gallons of aviation fuel each, feed the main engine through a small fuel line, and be jettisoned once empty to restore maneuverability. To the Luftwaffe, it sounded impossible, a fighter shedding its own range mid-mission like a snake shedding skin. But for the Americans, it was the missing piece of the puzzle. When paired with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the Mustang's efficiency turned from impressive to astonishing. It could now fly more than 2,500 kilometers on internal fuel alone, and with drop tanks, that distance more than doubled. This meant a P-51 could take off from East Anglia, climb to altitude over the English Channel, meet the bomber stream near the Dutch coast, and stay with it, all the way to Berlin. The 8th Air Force began large-scale testing through the winter months. The first escort mission stunned commanders. Pilots who once had to turn back halfway across Europe now stayed with their bomber formations until bombs fell on German cities. The effect on morale was immediate. Crews who had felt abandoned above the Reich suddenly looked out their windows and saw silver fighters holding formation beside them. For the Luftwaffe, that sight was alarming. The bomber streams were no longer unguarded once past the Rhine. Fighter sweeps once timed to attack unescorted bombers found themselves ambushed by agile, long-range Mustangs instead. Yet in the beginning, the Germans didn't believe what they were seeing. Early reports from frontline pilots spoke of new American aircraft showing up deeper and deeper inside German territory. Intelligence officers dismissed it as misidentification, perhaps Thunderbolts operating from forward bases. The distances didn't add up, but by February 1944 the truth became undeniable. Mustangs were being spotted and shot down, far beyond any known Allied fighter range. When wreckage was recovered from those early encounters, Luftwaffe engineers immediately noticed the strange wing attachments, the drop tanks. They seemed fragile, almost crude. Lightweight metal, paper laminates, rough welds, nothing like German engineering standards. But they worked. Each tank represented an extension of the Allied reach, a symbol that distance no longer guaranteed safety. In Berlin, this realization sent ripples through command headquarters. Albert Speer's armaments ministry had long relied on the assumption that central Germany was secure from sustained air assault. The Mustang and its disposable tanks shattered that illusion. It wasn't just a new fighter. It was the physical embodiment of Allied industrial might, a machine born from precision, mass production, and ruthless practicality. In March 1944, the 8th Air Force launched the first full-scale bombing campaign, escorted from start to finish by P-51s equipped with drop tanks. The results would soon echo from the skies of Berlin to the corridors of the Reich Chancellery. And when one of those aircraft fell into German hands, the men who examined it would understand, in metal and fuel lines, how their air superiority had vanished. The idea of the external fuel tank wasn't new. It had appeared in theory before the war, but few believed it practical. Early air forces prized performance above all. Adding detachable tanks meant weight, drag, and vulnerability. Pilots feared the tanks might leak, explode, or unbalance the aircraft during combat. But by late 1943, necessity forced innovation. Engineers at North American Aviation began rethinking the concept from scratch. They designed a lightweight, streamlined tank shaped like a teardrop, narrow at the tip, wide at the center, minimizing drag while maximizing volume. Made of thin aluminum or laminated paper sealed with resin, it was built for one purpose: to be used once and thrown away. Fuel lines ran from the tanks through simple valves into the aircraft's main system. A pilot could feed the Merlin engine from the externals first, then jettison the tanks once empty, instantly restoring agility. The process took seconds. To the Germans, this simplicity was unthinkable. German aircraft technology was often elegant, complex, even over-engineered. The American approach, cheap, light, and functional, was alien to their philosophy. But it was precisely this simplicity that gave the Allies their reach. A Mustang with two 75-gallon tanks could escort bombers deep into Germany, loiter over the target, and fight its way home, a feat no other fighter in the world could match in early 1944. Each tank effectively stretched Allied air power across Europe, an invisible bridge of fuel and aluminum connecting England to Berlin. It was technology at its most strategic, humble in form, decisive in effect, for the men who flew the Mustang. These new drop tanks were more than engineering experiments. They were lifelines. Pilots of the 8th Air Force had grown accustomed to watching bombers vanish in the distance, forced to turn back as their fuel gauges dropped. Many had lost friends over Germany, knowing they couldn't follow to protect them. Now, as they strapped into their P-51s fitted with two fragile metal pods beneath each wing, they understood what was at stake. The tanks could leak, catch fire, or fail to detach under stress, yet they trusted them. Every extra mile meant fewer bombers burning, fewer parachutes falling through flak. Mission briefings took on a new energy. Crews joked grimly that the paper tanks might dissolve in rain, but no one truly cared. For the first time, they could escort the bombers all the way. The psychological shift was immense. Bomber crews reported seeing fighters beside them even after crossing deep into German territory, a sight that raised morale and broke the Luftwaffe's rhythm. Major James Howard, one of the early Mustang aces, famously engaged dozens of German fighters alone over Oschersleben in January 1944, protecting a formation of B-17s until his ammunition was nearly gone. His courage, and his ability to be there at all, was thanks to those disposable fuel tanks hanging beneath his wings. Every pilot who flew long escort missions carried the same thought. These tanks might save hundreds of lives, and that belief turned fragile aluminum into something far stronger than steel. Trust. The addition of drop tanks didn't just extend range, it rewrote the rules of aerial warfare. Before the Mustang, escort missions worked like a relay. Fighters would accompany bombers as far as fuel allowed, then turn back to England while the next escort wing took over. The system created dangerous gaps, windows of vulnerability that the Luftwaffe exploited with precision. Now that pattern was gone. The Mustangs with drop tanks could stay with the bombers from takeoff to target. Even more devastating, they could break formation after the bombers dropped their payloads and hunt German fighters on the way back. This marked the birth of fighter sweeps, roving patrols of P-51s that struck airfields, rail lines, and any Luftwaffe aircraft attempting to take off. The Germans, used to choosing when and where to engage, suddenly found themselves on the defensive, reacting to an enemy that refused to go home. The shift in control was immediate. The Luftwaffe's interceptor units, once the pride of German air defense, they began to suffer catastrophic attrition. Every time they scrambled to intercept bombers, the Mustangs were already there. By the spring of 1944, American pilots were destroying German fighters not just in the air, but on the ground. Escort missions turned into search and destroy operations across the Reich, all because of two small fuel tanks that could be dropped at the flick of a switch. For the Allies, the impact was revolutionary. For Germany, it was the beginning of a nightmare, the realization that their heartland, once thought unreachable, was now within striking distance of every Allied bomber and every Mustang pilot with a pair of drop tanks. And soon, German intelligence would confront that truth firsthand. When the first reports of long-range American fighters reached Luftwaffe High Command in early 1944, disbelief was the standard reaction. Pilots claimed that Mustangs, once thought limited to northern France, were appearing deep inside German airspace, even near Berlin. These sightings were dismissed as errors in identification, perhaps overzealous claims from pilots shaken by the growing intensity of the war. But the wreckage told a different story. At a crash site near Hannover, a downed P-51 was recovered mostly intact. German engineers inspected it with professional curiosity. The airframe was unlike their own designs, sleek, light, aerodynamic in every line. But it was what hung beneath the wings that caught their attention. Two punctured, oddly fragile tanks, each no larger than a man, lay nearby in the grass. When the engineers lifted them, they were stunned by the weight. or rather, the lack of it. The tanks felt almost hollow, constructed from thin, pressed material that bent under pressure. To their trained eyes, it seemed absurd, a disposable fuel container meant to be discarded mid-flight. In Berlin, the Luftwaffe's technical office received the first reports from the field. The conclusion was sobering. These new Allied fighters were carrying external tanks, doubling their range and granting them endurance once thought impossible. At Rechlin, Germany's premier testing center, the tanks were examined in detail. Analysts noted their crude but efficient construction, minimal rivets, no reinforcement, just enough structure to hold fuel. It was the complete opposite of German design philosophy. The Americans had sacrificed durability for reach. One officer reportedly remarked, "They build as if they plan to lose them and still win the war." That observation captured the truth. The Allies were now mass-producing effectiveness, not perfection. Each throwaway tank represented another step toward total air superiority. Once the technical teams confirmed their findings, German intelligence began to assess what this meant for strategy. If American fighters could now escort bombers to Berlin, the Reich's entire defensive system, based on geography and range limitations, was compromised. Radar networks and fighter bases had been positioned to intercept unescorted bombers at predictable points. The Ruhr Castle, Hannover. Now those zones meant nothing. The Mustangs could remain with the bomber stream from start to finish, attacking interceptors at every stage. Reports poured in from squadron leaders. "Our fighters are being engaged before reaching the bombers." Others reported Mustangs strafing airfields immediately after raids, an unimaginable tactic only months before. In early March 1944, aerial reconnaissance photos confirmed what the reports suggested. Allied bombers striking targets as far east as Leipzig and Berlin under constant escort. The Reich's core industrial heart was no longer protected by distance. German intelligence tried to identify weaknesses in the system. Perhaps the tanks were fragile enough to be targeted. Perhaps they leaked under stress. But even if they did, the damage was done. Range had become a weapon, one that Germany couldn't counter quickly. Attempts were made to design similar external tanks for the Bf 109 and FW 190. But shortages of materials, fuel, and time meant few reached the front in meaningful numbers. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin and reeling from losses, couldn't adapt fast enough. The intelligence reports turned from technical assessment to grim acknowledgement. The Allies now possessed not just superior numbers but superior reach. Until 1944, there was a sense of invulnerability within Germany's borders. Cities like Berlin, Leipzig, and Dresden had air raid shelters, yes. But few believed that day-long precision raids escorted by fighters could ever happen. Bombers might reach them, but they would come alone, bleeding from the sky, shredded by the Luftwaffe's guns. Then came the day when Mustangs appeared over Berlin. It was March 4, 1944. For the first time, American fighters accompanied bombers the entire distance, dogfighting over the German capital itself. Witnesses described the surreal sight of silver aircraft darting between contrails high above the city, symbols of an air war that had breached every barrier of range, defense, and confidence. In the aftermath, Luftwaffe morale began to erode. Fighter pilots who once boasted of home field advantage now faced exhaustion, shorter fuel supplies, and constant pursuit. There was nowhere left to hide, no safe airfield untouched by strafing runs. For German civilians, the psychological impact was even deeper. The sky, once a symbol of protection of the Luftwaffe's pride, had turned hostile. Sirens became a daily rhythm. Children in Berlin learned to recognize the distant thunder of four-engine bombers and the sharper growl of the Mustangs that escorted them. In military briefings, commanders began referring to the new American range as the long arm. It was both an admission and a warning. The Reich was shrinking, mile by mile. By the time German scientists fully understood how those drop tanks worked, the reality had already set in. The tanks themselves were simple. The idea behind them was devastating. War, they realized, was no longer just about firepower. It was about reach, and that realization would define the battles to come. By March 1944, the experiment was over. The Allies no longer theorized about escort range. They were flying it. The mission that proved it came on March 4, 1944. The first successful bomber raid on Berlin, escorted all the way by P-51 Mustangs. For the Luftwaffe, it was the day the war in the air changed forever. At dawn, more than 600 B-17 flying fortresses lifted off from bases in East Anglia, their 4 engines shattering the morning calm. Trails of condensation laced the cold sky as they climbed to altitude, forming a column of silver that stretched for miles. Above and behind them, smaller shapes darted into position. The long-range escort groups, sleek Mustangs fitted with drop tanks beneath each wing, glinting in the pale light. The tanks held 75 gallons each, feeding the Merlin engines through narrow lines that trembled with vibration. Pilots watched their fuel gauges steadily drop but felt no fear. When the tanks ran dry, they'd pull the lever, hear the faint clunk as both detached, and the aircraft would feel instantly lighter, ready to fight. Below them, the ground turned from the gray fields of France to the frozen rivers of Germany. The bomber stream continued east, climbing higher toward the heart of the Reich. By midday, German radar screens began lighting up. Controllers at Würzburg and Bremen reported massive formations heading toward Berlin. Scramble orders went out across the region. Bf-109s and FW-190s roared into the sky, climbing in waves to intercept. But something was different. At 20,000 feet, before the interceptors even reached the bomber formations, they met the escorts. The Mustangs, now rid of their tanks, turned toward the climbing Germans with predatory precision. Captain Don Gentile of the 336th Fighter Squadron recalled the shock of seeing the enemy first. They didn't expect us to be there. Not that far in. Their climb turned to chaos. Dogfights erupted across the central German sky. Contrails spiraled and split. The clean air above Berlin became a churning field of aluminum and smoke. Mustangs slashed through German formations with speed that stunned their opponents. For the first time in the war, the Luftwaffe wasn't meeting bombers. It was meeting hunters. Meanwhile, the bomber stream reached Berlin nearly intact. Anti-aircraft fire burst around the city, black puffs marking the air defense's desperate response. But the escorts stayed overhead, weaving between flak bursts, driving off every intercept attempt. From the ground, Berliners looked up and saw something they'd never witnessed before: enemy fighters defending the bombers. The city's anti-aircraft batteries fired into a sky filled with both friend and foe, unable to tell them apart in the chaos. By late afternoon, the first Mustangs were turning west, their internal fuel still half full. They'd flown to Berlin, fought over it, and now were heading home. When the bomber crews landed that evening, the difference was clear in the mission logs. Losses were the lowest on any deep strike raid to date. Commanders studied the numbers and understood immediately. This was no longer a defensive escort operation. It was the start of air domination. In the days that followed, mission after mission repeated the feat: Munich, Leipzig, Hannover, and Regensburg. Each time the Mustangs went farther, each time with fewer bomber casualties. The Luftwaffe's intricate defense system, built on predictable range limits, began to crumble. For the German fighter pilots, it was a nightmare. Their tactics, massed head-on attacks, coordinated interception, depended on the absence of escorts at the deepest points of each raid. Now those same tactics turned suicidal. Every interception became a running battle against agile, aggressive Mustangs that refused to leave. Within weeks, Allied intelligence recorded a staggering shift in the kill ratios. Luftwaffe losses climbed. American air groups began achieving air superiority not only over Western Europe, but across the Reich itself. It wasn't just a tactical success. It was psychological collapse. One Luftwaffe ace, Oberstleutnant Walter Dahl, later wrote bitterly that the Americans had made Germany a battlefield in the sky without borders. He understood that the war for air control was no longer winnable. At every command briefing in Berlin, officers now repeated the same question: how are these fighters reaching us? The answer lay beneath those wrecked wings in German fields, the drop tanks that German scientists were beginning to examine. Tanks that looked primitive, disposable, almost laughably light, but they carried the future of air warfare. Soon, the engineers at Rechlin would dissect one, and with each measurement, each sketch, they would realize just how much the balance of the war had tilted. At the Luftwaffe's Rechlin Test Center, north of Berlin, a group of German engineers gathered around a long wooden table. Upon it lay the twisted remains of one of the mysterious external tanks recovered from a crashed P-51 Mustang near Magdeburg. They had examined countless captured Allied machines before. Spitfires, Thunderbolts, B-17s, but this was different. This object was not a weapon, not armor, not even a complex system. It was a crude metal shell, battered by impact and fire, yet it carried the quiet power of revelation. As they measured and dissected its parts, astonishment turned to disbelief. The tank was made of 0.020-inch aluminum, thin as a biscuit tin, welded only where necessary. Some sections were not metal at all. They were laminated paper soaked in resin and fuel-proof coating. It was light enough for a man to lift with one hand. The engineers found a single feed line, a simple pressure valve, and a primitive release mechanism designed to detach by pulling a cable in the cockpit. No redundant systems, no reinforcements, no attempt at recovery. It was, by every standard of German engineering, crude, but it worked. The calculations on the chalkboard told the story. Each tank added more than 600 kilometers of range. 2 tanks meant the Mustang could escort bombers from England, over the Rhine, across Germany, and back with fuel to spare. The logic was undeniable. An older engineer, once proud of Germany's meticulous aircraft standards, reportedly muttered under his breath, "They have defeated us with simplicity." The report sent to Berlin was clinical but grim. The Americans had achieved operational range through lightweight, disposable design. They had traded craftsmanship for quantity, and in the industrial war of 1944, quantity was winning. The Luftwaffe's technical staff scrambled for solutions. Could they replicate the design? In theory, yes. But production was impossible. Germany lacked the materials, the fuel, and the manufacturing capacity to mass-produce single-use items. Their aircraft factories were already strained, bombed daily by the very Mustangs they sought to match. In frustration, Göring demanded explanations. How had intelligence failed to predict this? His generals could offer none. The assumption that American fighters could not reach Berlin had been treated as fact, a truth woven into every defensive strategy. That truth had evaporated in the contrails over the capital. The Rechlin engineers continued their analysis. They mapped the tank's airflow pattern, studied the way it attached to the Mustang's hardpoints, even attempted to reverse engineer one using available alloys. But the deeper they studied, the clearer it became. The power wasn't in the tank's material. It was in the idea behind it. The Americans built weapons to be used and lost. Germany built weapons to be preserved and perfect. One philosophy exhausted resources. The other multiplied them. As the tests continued, reports from the front grew worse. Luftwaffe formations were being shredded. The Mustangs were not only protecting bombers but attacking interceptors before they could climb. Airfields from Münster to Kassel were being strafed by returning P-51s, fighters with enough fuel left after a 1,000-mile mission to hunt targets of opportunity. In the skies, the imbalance grew visible. The once feared German aces, men like Hartmann, Ruhl, and Barkhorn, now flew fewer sorties, grounded as fuel became scarce and replacements dwindled. Meanwhile, the 8th Air Force fielded hundreds of fresh pilots and machines every week. Inside command bunkers, the tone shifted from defiance to desperation. One general remarked that the Americans had brought the war to every kilometer of German sky. The engineers' final report to the Air Ministry in April 1944 contained a single devastating line. The P-51, equipped with external tanks, has rendered the Reich's defensive perimeter meaningless. From that moment, there was no illusion left. The bombing campaign intensified. Daylight raids struck oil refineries, aircraft plants, and transportation hubs. The Mustangs became executioners of the Luftwaffe, clearing the skies before each new wave of B-17s arrived. In May 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe lost over 1,500 aircraft. For every German pilot killed, several more were unable to fly due to fuel shortages or destroyed bases. American bomber losses, once catastrophic, dropped by more than half. The technological discovery at Rechlin had not merely exposed a machine, it had revealed a shift in the nature of warfare itself. Industrial power now determined tactical possibility. The Mustang's drop tanks were not a triumph of design but of philosophy. Fight smarter, not prettier. That understanding spread through German ranks like a slow sickness. Pilots looked at their own planes, magnificent, deadly, but short-legged, and felt the limits of their reach. When Mustangs began sweeping over Berlin again in April, the men who had studied those tanks at Rechlin could only watch the contrails form high above and know, with mathematical certainty, why they were there. The air war for Europe was no longer balanced on skill or courage. It was now decided by range, and the Allies had all of it. By the summer of 1944, the skies above Europe had changed beyond recognition. What had once been a dangerous corridor of attrition for Allied bombers had transformed into an open highway of dominance. The P-51 Mustang, now equipped with its lightweight drop tanks, patrolled that sky like a predator that no longer feared its prey. From bases in England, hundreds of Silver fighters launched daily, flying east toward the Reich. They crossed the Channel over the Netherlands and deep into Germany's industrial heartlands, places once believed untouchable. For the first time since the war began, the Luftwaffe could no longer promise to defend its homeland. At airfields across the Reich, German ground crews stood in the dawn haze, scanning for their returning fighters. Many never came back. When they did, the damage told the story. Wings riddled, engines coughing, fuel nearly gone. The Mustangs had destroyed the Luftwaffe's freedom of maneuver. Pilots like John C. Meyer, George Preddy, and Chuck Yeager roamed from the Ruhr to Berlin, engaging targets at will. Their mission briefings grew simple: escort the bombers, then hunt. In just months, the Luftwaffe's elite, the few hundred experienced aces who had carried the war since 1939, were being lost faster than Germany could replace them. The Allies had achieved what months of bombing could not: the destruction of Germany's air defense from the inside out. Factories that once turned out hundreds of Bf-109s and FW-190s were now in ruins. Assembly lines halted not because of design failure, but because no one could reach work. Rail lines, bridges, and fuel convoys had been systematically erased by Mustang attacks. And in the air, the psychological collapse was even deeper. German pilots began referring to the Mustangs as Langstrecken Tod, the long-range death. They knew that even if they escaped one engagement, another squadron would be waiting further along the route home. Berlin, which had once slept under the protection of the Luftwaffe's claim of range superiority, now lived beneath a different sound: the distant, steady thunder of American engines. From February 1944 onward, P-51s could escort bombers not just to the city but beyond it, covering the retreat and striking at airfields on the way back. The German populace, already exhausted from years of war, began to sense the inevitable. The air raid sirens were no longer a rare terror. They became a rhythm of daily life. In the fields and ruins, citizens watched dogfights unfold far above, white vapor trails looping like scars across the blue. At Oschersleben, Regensburg, Augsburg, and Leipzig, bomber streams stretched for miles, with Mustang escorts darting in and out of formation, tiny silver guardians among black clouds of flak. The contrast was brutal. Disciplined precision from the air, chaotic destruction on the ground. Every Luftwaffe countermeasure came too late. The new Me-262 jet promised hope, but it arrived in handfuls, starved of fuel and pilots. The drop tank innovation had effectively erased Germany's timeline for technological recovery. While German scientists experimented, the Allies executed daily, relentlessly. By September 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost operational control over nearly every front. The skies over France were empty of German fighters. Over Western Germany, Allied bombers flew without fear. On the Eastern Front, even the Soviet Air Force began to press harder, exploiting the collapse. Historians often credit radar, logistics, or production numbers for the Allied air victory, and all played their part. But among those who lived through it, there was a quieter understanding. The war had been lost the day a simple drop tank gave the Mustang the reach of destiny. In a war obsessed with size, speed, and firepower, victory had come from lightness, from a decision to make something disposable, cheap, and efficient. That single design choice didn't just extend range, it extended possibility, and with every mission that reached Berlin and returned home, the message grew louder. The Luftwaffe's age was over, yet the collapse of Germany's skies was only part of the story. What came next would reshape the very philosophy of air warfare. how every nation, every engineer, and every pilot would think about range, endurance, and design for decades to come. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of the force that once terrorized Europe. Its airfields, once symbols of pride, had become graveyards of steel. Charred wrecks of Bf-109s and Fw-190s lay scattered across the frozen ground, destroyed not in glorious combat, but under strafing runs by the same Mustangs whose existence had rewritten the map of air warfare. Fuel had become the new front line. German pilots were often ordered to fly only in emergencies, saving precious aviation gasoline for the defense of Berlin. Some were even towed into the air by other aircraft to conserve every drop. It was a desperate calculus born from the total loss of air control. The Mustang, meanwhile, was evolving further. With the addition of 110-gallon drop tanks, its range extended beyond 1,500 miles. Entire bomber groups could now be escorted from takeoff to target and home again, something unimaginable just a year before. At air bases in England, the sense of reversal was palpable. Crews who once expected heavy losses now watched their comrades return, aircraft gleaming with bullet holes yet whole. The strategy had flipped. No longer were the bombers sacrificial. They were unstoppable formations, shielded by their own angels of death. From the industrial centers of the Ruhr to the outskirts of Berlin, German civilians began to see a pattern. Daylight meant destruction. Trains stopped running, factories slowed, and the once proud Luftwaffe posters were torn from walls or left to flap in the wind. The myth of invincibility was gone. The Rechlin report, which had first analyzed the Mustang's tanks, was now an archival relic. The Germans had tried to copy them, crude replicas made from tin and inferior alloys. But by then, production chaos and Allied bombing made such efforts meaningless. Ironically, in the ruins of Germany, many of those same engineers would later be recruited by the Allies under Operation Paperclip, bringing with them a sobering respect for what they had studied. They had learned the most painful truth of modern warfare: efficiency beats elegance. When Berlin finally fell in May 1945, fragments of Mustang wreckage were found alongside the ruins of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, metal mixed with history. The skies over the city, once roaring with duels of aces, now belonged to silence. American and British pilots flying victory patrols over the smoking capital often remarked on the surreal stillness. No flak, no interceptors, just the endless horizon that the Mustang had conquered. The numbers told the final story. By war's end, the P-51 had destroyed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft in air combat, more than any other Allied fighter. Its long-range capability had turned what began as a defensive escort into an offensive spearhead. But perhaps the greater victory lay beyond the statistics. The Mustang had changed how the world thought about air power. It had proven that reach was not merely a technical advantage, it was strategic dominance. To project power anywhere, one needed to stay airborne longer than the enemy could survive. The philosophy born from those disposable tanks would shape the next half-century of aviation. Jet bombers, long-range fighters, aerial refueling, all traced their lineage to the day someone decided to give a fighter the endurance of a bomber. In the ashes of the Third Reich, captured German engineers would look upon the Mustang not as a marvel of materials or speed, but as a lesson in purpose. The Americans had not built a perfect plane. They had built a decisive one. As one Luftwaffe technician later recalled to Allied interrogators, "We built machines for the pilot." They built machines for the mission. That mission had reached Berlin and returned home. But even as victory banners were raised and the world exhaled after 6 years of fire, the story of the Mustang and the lesson of its drop tanks carried something deeper than triumph. It carried a reflection on the nature of ingenuity and on how the smallest idea can alter the fate of nations. In the ruins of Europe, long after the smoke cleared and the engines went silent, the story of the P-51 Mustang endured, not as a tale of metal and fire, but as a symbol of vision. Its greatness was not born from raw power or armor, but from a single, almost humble invention, a thin, disposable tank that could be dropped and forgotten. What seemed ordinary on the surface had quietly rewritten the logic of air warfare. It proved that war was not always won by the most advanced or the most expensive, but by the most adaptable. The Allies did not outbuild Germany in craftsmanship, They outthought it in strategy. The Mustang's extended range allowed them to carry the war into the enemy's heart, to fight where they were never supposed to reach, and to return, something no German fighter could claim. In that range lay freedom. Freedom for the bombers that no longer died alone. Freedom for the airmen who saw the enemy's capital and came home to tell it. And freedom, eventually, for the millions beneath those skies who would wake one morning to find the war finally ending. The German engineers who examined those tanks had unknowingly witnessed the turning point of the air war. Their discovery was more than mechanical. It was philosophical. It forced the world to see that innovation in war does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers through simplicity. In the years that followed, the lesson endured. Every fighter jet, every bomber, every long-range mission carried the ghost of that idea. That endurance is power, and that reach can redefine destiny. The Mustang story is not just about how a plane reached Berlin and back. It's about how clarity of purpose defeated complexity of design. In that quiet truth lies the enduring legacy of the Second World War's most decisive machine. A fighter born from ingenuity, carried by courage and remembered for a single, beautiful fact: it could go further than anyone thought possible. And it came back.